I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to present this work, and I would like to thank you for still being there. It's been a long day. And the work I'm going to present you today is about the perception of money. And this work has been done together with Florent Méniel and Sacha Bourgeois-Gironde, who are here in the audience. So I'm not going to talk about neuroeconomics. As you have heard today, neuroeconomics is mainly about choices, about valuation, about decision-making. And while reading the literature in neuroeconomics, it appeared that there is this idea that we have a common valuation tool and that one of the instantiation of this common valuation tool is money. So we got interested into this topic of money a little bit incidentally. So we realized that despite the fact that money plays a central role in our societies, we don't know much about how the brain reacts to money. So what comes to mind when one sees this kind of picture is that the basic neural reaction to this type of pictures is greed or something like this. And we actually know from neuroscience, but also from many other fields, that money is a very powerful incentive. But from a biological point of view, money is a little bit particular in the sense that it's a secondary reward. It does not correspond to an immediate need as food, for instance. But even if it's a secondary reward, not a primary one, it uses the same reward circuits as the ecological rewards that correspond to biological needs. But still, this left us with the very basic question, how is money perceived? Is it only greed? Just by analogy, if you consider the domain of social interactions, when one is engaged in complex social interactions, one has to identify the person. You're talking with someone, you have to identify who you're talking to. You have to identify what kind of emotions are expressed by the person you're talking to. And to this kind of complex operations, there is a very preliminary step, which is you should look at the face of this person. So you should be able to recognize what is a face. So recognizing what is a face is a preliminary step for complex social behavior. And from our perspective, understanding how money is perceived is a kind of preliminary step to understand more complex and probably more interesting also economic behavior. So the question turned out to be how and when is money recognized as money in the brain? And this apparently simple question turned out to be a little bit more difficult than expected because we had to find a way to define what money is. So what defines money? Even if we take the most typical instantiation of money, which are coins, it's not always easy to define what a coin is. So what differentiates a coin from a disc of metal, which has a very similar visual aspect? And a disc of metal can be considered as a coin if it can be exchanged for goods and services, in the sense that it is a coin as long as everyone agrees it is a coin. So this makes money a little bit unusual object for neuroscience. Money is a category of objects that are defined by social agreements, a little bit like words, for instance. A word is a word because everyone agrees that a word is a word. This is very different from what is typically studied in the visual system, such as categories that are defined by visual similarities, such as faces, for instance. So where and when in the brain is a coin classified as money? What kind of hypothesis can we make? Just to show you that it's pretty difficult to make hypotheses, these are faces. Okay? It's extremely easy from a single glance to say these are faces. I will now show you words. Actually, half of these stimuli are not words, but it's much more difficult to recognize. Okay. So there are, this one you probably all know it. This is the same one in French and in kanji, and these are pseudo words. But I could tell you that this is a word, this is a pseudo word for all those of you that don't write Japanese. It would be very difficult to know whether I'm right or wrong. And the same holds true with coins, actually. There are some coins you're familiar with. Probably you're familiar with the euros and with British pounds. But there are other coins which are maybe a little bit more difficult to know whether they are real coins or not. For instance, this is a Deutschmark. So for those of you that have never lived in Europe, you have to remember, is it still a coin or is it no longer a coin? This is a token, a casino token, which really looks like a coin. This is a real coin from, I think, Singapore. From a state from Central Asia. I don't remember which one, actually. And this is an old coin from Singapore, which is no longer used. So it's also very difficult for coins to know what is a coin and what is just a disk of metal, but that is not endowed with any economic property. So we were basically interested in this issue. How do we classify what is a coin and what is not a coin? And with an additional question about the nature of a potential neural representation of money. When one looks in the fields of anthropology, sociology, or psychology, money is really considered as a very polymorphous concept. It's a common valuation tool, it's used as a reference scale, but still there are very different types of money. For instance, if you win money at the lottery, you probably won't do the same things that if you have a pay rise of the same amount of money. In one case, you will do something unusual with your money. In the other case, you will save it for your children, for instance. So in economics, there is this fundamental hypothesis that money is exchangeable, fungible, and this suggests that at the neural level, there should be at some point a single general-purpose representation of money. So we wondered to what extent is the neural representation of money shaped by experience in the brain. So we now have two factors of interest to study money in the brain. The first one is validity, what makes the difference between a coin and a disk of metal, and familiarity, whether the subject has had economic experience with the coins or not. So we took advantage of the changes that occurred in 2002 in the Eurozone, where local currencies were replaced by euros, which means that for all those of you that live in Europe, there are coins that have lost their money status. French franc in France, Deutschmarks in Germany, but still they retain their visual appearance. It's just that they have changed status. They are no longer money. So we used French francs and Finnish marks that are both invalid coins in the sense that they can no longer be used as money. And we contrasted them with euros and Australian dollars that are both valid money currently in use. And for French subjects, French francs are familiar as well as euros, but Finnish marks and Australian dollars are unfamiliar, and we made sure that the subject we used in our study never lived in Finland nor in Australia. So basically, we have a typical 2x2 factorial design in which we contrasted valid versus invalid money and familiar with unfamiliar coins. So we can, in principle, answer our two questions: where and when is money detected, and does experience matter? So these are the actual stimuli we used. And here are the euros, Australian dollars, French francs, and Finnish marks. And in all cases, we used a unit of currency and 10-cent coins and made sure that they were at least a little bit similar in the sense that the value of the coin was written and these kind of things. We also had a series of scrambled controls. These are just scrambled pieces of coins just to make sure that our results are not due to low-level visual confounds. And subjects were instructed about the coins. We showed them a slideshow with this kind of information. Euros are currently in use in the Eurozone, together with the two coins we used in the experiments, as well as for Australian dollars, French francs that were used in France until 2002, and Finnish marks were used in Finland until 2002. And then we just made sure that subjects correctly understood this information. They had a small test. They were shown the pictures of coins, and they had to say whether the coins are currently in use or not, and from which region, and they had a feedback whether they were correct and incorrect. So we just made sure that they knew about the coins they were to see during the experiment. And this was how the experiment ran. Fixation cross, a coin, a delay, another coin, and then subject had to compare the current coin with the previous one. If they are different, they do nothing. If the current coin is similar to the previous one, they have to press a button, and then they get a feedback. So this is called the one-back comparison task in cognitive neuroscience. This is a very basic task. We are actually not interested in how the subject performs the task. We don't study the repeated coins. It's just to keep the subject busy and make sure that they are attending to the pictures. So economic validity is incidental to the task, and it has no effect on behavior. So we are studying those coins that are not repeated, and the subject does not react to them. And we are doing this using MEG, which is magnetoencephalographic recordings. For those of you who are not familiar with this technique, it records the currents generated by neural activity at the millisecond time scale. So it's a little bit different from functional MRI in the sense that it's a direct measure of neural activity, but it's the spatial resolution is very loose. We have a very good appreciation of the brain dynamics, but a very poor spatial resolution. So we recorded 13 subjects in this experiment, and there were subjects older than in classical cognitive neuroscience experiments because we wanted to make sure that there were at least 27 in 2002. And then we get typically this type of data with what goes on before stimulus onset. The stimulus is presented at time 0, and about 100 milliseconds later, we have a first wave of activity, and we know from decades of research in human electrophysiology that this corresponds to activity in the posterior visual system, so some basic operations on visual images, and a second wave of activity around 150 milliseconds, which corresponds to a flow of information in the ventral visual pathway. So we first looked at the effect of our factors on the first wave of activity around 100 milliseconds, and we get indeed activity in the posterior visual system. But this activity is similar for valid and invalid coins, and as well for familiar and unfamiliar stimulus. So this is just a kind of confirmation that there is no low-level confound in our experiment. The real interesting finding is later, around 150 milliseconds. There, you see this kind of pattern of activity, which is typical for information flowing in the ventral visual pathway that analyzes the identity of visual objects. And here, what we find is that we have an activity which is different for valid coins in red, euros and dollars, than for invalid coins in black, French francs and Finnish marks, and over both left and right hemisphere. So we have this very strong effect of economic validity around 150 milliseconds, which corresponds to a reduction of activity for valid coins that is highly significant. This effect is completely absent from scrambled stimuli, so there is no low-level confound. And what came as a surprise was that the effect of validity is absolutely not influenced by familiarity. If you look at the curves here, the difference between euros and francs is the same as for Australian dollars and Finnish marks that the subject had never seen before the experiment. So we do observe a neural distinction between valid and invalid coins as early as 150 milliseconds that is not affected by prior economic experience. If we look at the results in an fMRI style and do some source localization, around 150 milliseconds, we find that there is activity in the ventral system. This is what is coded in gray here, that there is an activation of the ventral visual system. And then within this system, we looked at the economic validity effect on red to yellow scale that you can see here. So you can see that the effect is found within the regions that are known to analyze visual objects, such as faces, for instance. So this validity effect is found in the ventral visual system. And what is a little bit surprising is that we find the categorization of something which is a cultural, symbolic artifact in regions that are known to analyze visual similarities and to use visual similarities to categorize faces, for instance. And this categorization is as fast as for natural objects such as faces, again. And this categorization is not dependent on familiarity, although it is well known that the activity in these regions is usually shaped by experience. So from a neural point of view, these results are a little bit unexpected. So we do observe a neural representation of money that seems to be generic and independent from personal experience. This lends support to the economist's assumption of a single general-purpose representation of money. We also find that the categorization of a symbolic cultural artifact occurs surprisingly early in the visual system. In other words, the categorization of money is closer to the categorization of faces than to the categorization of words. And this categorization is based on knowledge rather than on direct experience. And this is also quite unexpected from a neural point of view. So if we elaborate a little bit on our results, have we found the money area, as I often asked? Certainly not. Money is a too recent invention. It was invented around 3,000 years before Christ to have influenced brain evolution. But probably money reuses the ability of the ventral visual system at dealing with symbol. And this idea of cultural recycling has been put forward by Stanislas Dehaene and Laurent Cohen for words and for numbers. And we think that it's also the case for this cultural artifact that money is. And from an evolutionary perspective, monkeys are equipped with a very similar categorization machinery. And they can be taught to use money in much the same way as humans use money. This was shown recently. Our results also suggest that cultural knowledge is very efficient. It is as efficient as direct experience. And we think that this might, our results about money might derive from visual food processing. Well, it is noted that both money and food activate the dopaminergic system. I'm more concerned here about visual categorization, visual identifications of sources of money or sources of food. It has been shown recently that food can be categorized according to its energy content within the same region and at the same speed than what we find with money. It is known that food categorization can be transmitted from one animal to the other. For instance, rats usually send an old rat to test a new type of food and see whether it's becoming ill or not. If not ill, then all the rats go and eat the new food. This is a typical type of cultural transmission that could be used in the case of cultural artifacts such as money. And it's also well known that the desire for food and money interact, and this has been shown pretty rigorously again recently. Whatever the neural processes, money processing is rooted in some older ecological processing. Food is only one possibility, but whatever the process, the ease with which the category money is processed by the brain probably participates to the worldwide success of money. And thank you for your attention.
Merci de cette présentation concise et tout à fait éclairante. Je passe la parole à ceux qui souhaitent intervenir en français ou en anglais. Stanislas.
Oui, c'est un exposé très intéressant. Je pense que la vitesse avec laquelle tu trouves que l'argent est traité est tout à fait compatible avec d'autres expériences, et notamment à nouveau celle de Mathias Pessiglione, qui montre que même une pièce de monnaie d'une livre ou d'un penny qui est présentée de façon subliminale et qui est masquée conduit encore à des effets importants sur la motivation des sujets. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a une forme de motivation subliminale. Et donc ces expériences suggèrent que non seulement tu peux avoir un traitement de l'image d'une pièce de monnaie, mais un traitement qui ne s'arrête pas à la forme visuelle, mais qui va jusqu'au sens quantitatif. Et ça m'amène à ma question, est-ce que tu as regardé s'il y avait dans tes expériences des activations cérébrales qui ne distinguaient pas simplement les différentes catégories de pièces, mais aussi qui est corrélée avec la valeur de façon monotone?
Voilà, alors, on n'a pas cherché avec la valeur de façon monotone, parce qu'en fait, c'est quelque chose qu'on voulait faire initialement, mais ça ne tenait pas dans le design en termes de nombre d'essais. C'est une manip qu'on veut faire ensuite, parce que là, on a 1 et 10, donc 10 centimes et l'unité, ce qui est un peu gênant, parce que 1 est plus petit que 10, et 10 est plus... il y a un conflit entre la relation d'ordre numérique entre 1 et 10 et le fait que ce soit en fait 0, 1 et 1, qu'on va comparer en termes de monnaie. Ce qu'on a regardé par contre, c'est que l'effet qu'on observe ici est le même qu'on regarde les unités monétaires ou qu'on regarde les centimes. Donc ça semble être plus quelque chose de générique, c'est de l'argent, c'en est pas, que quelque chose lié à la grandeur monétaire elle-même. Cela dit, dans cette manip-là, étudier la grandeur monétaire elle-même, c'est difficile. Il aurait fallu qu'on ait 10 centimes, 1 et 2, mais là on tombait sur des problèmes bêtes, du genre les pièces de 2 francs ne ressemblent pas du tout aux autres, enfin bref, des problèmes expérimentaux pas palpitants, mais qui ont fait qu'on n'a pas pu répondre à cette question-là.
Bon, alors, je répète, la monnaie est actuellement beaucoup plus souvent représentée par du papier, par des notes, des billets ou des chèques, que par des pièces. Est-ce que vous avez fait le même type d'expérience avec du papier-monnaie ?
Non, pas encore. Bien sûr, on voudrait savoir si ce qu'on observe là se généralise à d'autres types de monnaie. Donc, l'étape d'après logique, c'est les billets, et ensuite, c'est de la monnaie virtuelle. Là, on a voulu commencer par travailler sur ce que les gens citent en général comme étant la forme la plus typique de l'argent. Donc il y a un peu de variation culturelle, mais enfin la pièce de monnaie reste quand même l'emblème de l'argent, et c'est par là que les enfants en général apprennent ce que c'est que l'argent. Donc ça nous a semblé être un point de départ intéressant. C'est une expérience qu'on doit généraliser à d'autres choses, bien sûr.
Et justement, est-ce que vous croyez que l'être humain est capable de faire quelque chose, d'agir avec des pièces de monnaie qui dépassent, par exemple, 1 euro, parce que moi j'ai travaillé un peu là-dessus, au niveau des réactions que provoque la monnaie. Moi, il me semble que c'est très difficile quand ça dépasse. Je pense que c'est intéressant que vous ayez travaillé sur les centimes, parce qu'il me semble que tout ce qui dépasse 1 euro ou 1 c'est très difficile pour l'être. Je ne sais pas, vous avez déjà travaillé un peu là-dessus. Et alors, j'attache tout de suite mon autre question. Il règne. Ok, est-ce que vous ne croyez pas qu'il y a aussi quelque chose au niveau du corps qui serait étudié? Parce que l'être humain, normalement, c'est quelqu'un qui réagit avec tout son être.
Donc là, comme je dis, c'est une expérience, il y en aurait plein d'autres à faire. C'est quelque chose qui débute. Donc nous, on n'a pas regardé avec des grandeurs supérieures. Si on fait une étude sur les billets, ça sera évidemment quelque chose qu'il faudra prendre en compte, puisqu'il s'agit forcément de valeurs plus grandes. Ensuite, sur les réactions corporelles, oui, bien sûr, on n'a pas un cerveau qui flotte de façon isolée. C'est inscrit dans un corps qui réagit également. Donc ça, c'est des choses qui peuvent aussi s'étudier en termes de réactions électrodermales ou de choses comme ça, mais qu'on n'a pas faites pour l'instant.
Merci. Je voudrais vous poser une question qui déborde un petit peu. Aujourd'hui, l'argent a une puissance de fascination exceptionnelle. On le voit parmi les joueurs qui jouent au casino. On le voit aussi dans l'économie criminelle. La question que je voudrais vous poser, c'est est-ce que vous êtes arrivé d'examiner en situation des gens qui sont aliénés ou devenus addictifs, en essayant de voir le conflit entre le système de récompense et le système d'alerte à l'intérieur du cerveau?
Donc là, non, ça, c'est pas des choses qu'on a regardées pour l'instant, mais oui, bien sûr, il y a des études qui sont faites sur les joueurs et sur l'addiction à l'argent. Mais là, je pense que nous ce que l'on regarde, c'est quelque chose qui est bien plus simple que ça, qui se présente bien plus en amont de ça, qui est vraiment la base du fait de réaliser que quelque chose qui est purement culturel constitue une catégorie d'un point de vue neuronal. Et je ne pense pas que ça puisse expliquer des réactions d'addiction à l'argent, par exemple. C'est bien plus simpliste que ça, ce qu'on montre ici.
Vous dites quelque chose qui est purement qui est culturel, l'argent, typiquement. La formule de Tolstoï, c'était l'argent, la monnaie, c'est de la liberté frappée. Donc, est-ce qu'on est... Dans les représentations, on peut considérer qu'une pièce de monnaie, c'est un objet. C'est-à-dire que c'est quelque chose d'extrêmement concret. Mais est-ce que dans les représentations cérébrales, on a, je pense, une différence entre la catégorie abstraite, c'est-à-dire la représentation d'une représentation, le pouvoir de choix qui est dans la monnaie, et l'objet qui lui-même est aliénant, c'est-à-dire l'objet, c'est l'absence de pouvoir de choix puisqu'on a l'objet. C'est donc la caractéristique spécifique de la monnaie, c'est qu'elle contient en elle-même la liberté, le choix, le redevenir. Est-ce que ça, on peut, en catégorisation cérébrale, en représentation, est-ce qu'on peut arriver à le discerner? Vous voyez ce que je veux dire?
Je pense que je cerne un peu l'idée, je ne suis pas sûre de saisir toutes les subtilités. On a essayé un petit peu de voir justement si on avait une représentation un peu abstraite de l'argent, au sens où quand on vous présente un objet visuel que vous n'avez jamais vu, que vous n'avez jamais eu dans votre porte-monnaie, que vous n'avez jamais utilisé pour acheter quelque chose, le seul fait qu'on vous dise que c'est l'argent de tel ou tel pays suffit à ce qu'il soit rangé dans cette boîte-là. Donc il me semble que ça va dans le sens de cette idée que c'est une représentation relativement abstraite de l'argent. Ce qui est venu comme une surprise, hein. Très honnêtement, on montait la manip en pensant trouver un effet de familiarité très fort. Et c'est venu comme une surprise que non, en fait, il suffit qu'on nous ait dit « ça c'est de l'argent », sans qu'on ait besoin d'avoir eu le contact avec l'objet, sans qu'on ait eu à le manipuler. Ça me surprend toujours qu'on trouve ce pattern de résultat.
Bien, merci pour cette définition de la monnaie liberté.